So we're real excited because we're using our auto switch feature. So if it looks like we have a real schizophrenic producer, it's because we've just found a new toy to play with. Sure. Hi, I'm Larry.
And I'm Kevin.
And we are producing a podcast, as Phil would say, called Stuffin' Things.
Yeah, we're stuffing things, as Phil hates to say.
Phil's not with us this morning. He's having to work. Let's have a moment of silence for Phil. Okay, we're okay.
All right. So today we're going to be talking about the ideal and how that fits into dualism. And so to give some preface of how we are coming to this discussion, last night Phil and I were talking about one of our friends, and his name for this sake is Bob. And Bob is very self-aware and really figures things out for himself. And so something that might take Larry or myself 2 minutes of Googling to find out, it'll take Bob 30 minutes just because he really wants to understand exactly what's going on there. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's very admirable of him to do that. And so he knows himself very well. He knows what he wants very well. And in that, though, Phil very much was idolizing him and wants to be more like him, because Phil really does seeks and strives to be someone that understands what they actually believe, what they actually think, and doesn't want to just be a parrot of somebody else. Just had the connotation of that sounds a lot like dualism to me. And so I was trying to explain to Phil that you shouldn't set that person as that idol that you want to strive to be like. You should set that person's ideals and what they are doing in their life as your idol, because if that person ever fails in doing that striving, then all of a sudden you run into a situation where that person isn't the same person anymore to you, but that person hasn't changed. They're still human and they still are who they are. They just haven't met your expectation of how you set them as an idol. And so I was telling Phil that Larry has a very good grasp and vernacular on dualism. And so I figured this would be a good forum for Larry to speak about what dualism is and how it affects our Western society.
All right, so if you'll allow me a little bit of a monologue instead of a dialogue for just a second, I'll share how I got interested in dualism and how it became an actual big issue in my life. So here's the definition of dualism. The division of something conceptually into two opposed or contrasted aspects, or the state of being so divided. And it is also talked about in ways that establish it as the foundation for reality. That reality is basically dualistic, meaning that it's two more or less equal but opposed forces, good and bad, yin and yang, stuff like that. The idea of dualism playing that role in the Western culture is kind of inherited from Greek Platonic thought. And so I pastor a church, and a few years ago I just became aware of this through teaching a friend of mine named Harold Eberle and some other people, at how what we think is biblical thought is in reality dualistic Greek philosophic thought. And so there's no doubt that there's dualism in the world. You know, there's things that are opposed and things that work against one another. But as a grounds for reality, I don't believe dualism measures up. And it would mean that for good to be good, there always has to be evil. It would mean that for light to be light, there always has to be dark. And in the cosmology that I understand, in the cosmology that I believe in, that isn't true. So there's a debate about dualism as a basic philosophy for reality. We almost always believe it. We're conditioned by it. And then another important aspect of it is what Kevin mentioned, which was the concept of the ideal. And I reflected back to when I think it was in junior high. It was a long, long time ago. And that was a long time ago. I remember getting off my horse and buggy one day and going to school. No, it wasn't quite that long ago. I did have a bus to ride. But I remember them talking about Platonic dualism. And they used an illustration of a chair. And at the time, of course, there were desk chairs and the teacher's chair, and there was a chair sitting outside. They said, so all of these are representatives of chairs, but up here, up someplace, there is the ideal chair, and it embodies all of the stuff that a chair is. Well, in philosophy of dualism or religions that have dualism in them, that ideal then becomes the thing that you strive for. This is where we get into trouble, and I think this is what Kevin and Phil were talking about. So I had a kind of an encounter with God, actually, where I was struggling after having had these thoughts and having recognized the pressure that comes from the ideal, the pressure that I need to be better, I need to study more, I need to read more, I need to do this more. And I remember journaling one day, and I said, Lord, I feel like I'm trapped and being sucked into this dualism thing and the ideal. And I felt like he responded to me and said, well, you are, but you don't have to. And so I began to kind of get ready, and I expected to get some good instruction or something. And what I felt like the Lord said was, Larry, you're the only you I know, and I like you. And I thought, wow. And it really, really impacted me, because I realized that a lot of the internal pressure in life that I experience and that I see other people experience as a pastor is because they're chasing the ideal them. And it's a moving target, because as soon as you get close, there's just more that you could do. So then I felt like I got some instruction as well, that as a pastor, I have a relatively good heart, and I want the best for people. But I felt like it was brought to my attention that by looking for the ideal person, so I meet somebody and they explain their life situation to me, and then I would immediately, in a dualistic way of thinking, I would create this ideal for them, and then I would try to help them get there. But then I realized that meant I wasn't dealing with the real person. I was dealing with some kind of weird hybrid or just the ideal person. And I think that's what you were talking about, Kevin, is the possibility of falling into that trap. So you end up not actually having a relationship with the person in front of you, or you end up not actually being the person you are to have that relationship, because you've slipped into this realm of ideal, and you have ideal grappling with ideal, and the reality is left out of the whole equation.
Right. That is exactly what we were talking about. So, yeah, for me, you definitely have to strip the ideal away. Otherwise, you don't see the person for who they really are. And I think that's something that we miss a lot in our society. And I know even in my own head, a lot of times I'll think about a conversation I'm going to have with someone rather than just going and having that conversation with them. And so if we can learn to do both, I don't think having that conversation in your head is wrong, because it can prepare you for possibilities of what the conversation will be, but don't limit yourself to just having that conversation in your head. Actually have that conversation with the person and see what they're actually thinking. Because I know for myself, I don't do it as often as I should, I don't think.
Yeah, one of the things I really appreciate about you, Kevin, is you jump more quickly than most people I know to the practical relational aspect of a thought, and you don't just get caught up in the thought itself as much. Doesn't mean you don't think, but there's always room for people in relationships in your thing. Here's the definition of ideal, and the reason I'm going to read this is because I don't know, I've not talked to anybody in this journey of understanding the pressure of dualism, the false nature of it, as well as the positive nature, but especially the pressure of the ideal. I've never talked to anybody that didn't think the ideal was a positive. I mean, they just assume it, Right. Here's the actual definitions. If you just look and define the ideal the way Google puts it, it says satisfying one's conception of what is perfect or most suitable. Now, I think everybody generally has that sense of the ideal, and you could say what's wrong with it, but here's the secondary definition, or number 2, the way they put it. Existing only in the imagination, desirable or perfect, but not likely to become a reality.
Yeah.
That's powerful. And I think that's the danger of the ideal. And I think if you give yourself to dualism being the reality, the basis of reality, and we can talk about why it's not if you want to, but I just propose that it's not. If you talk about it being, it constantly begs you to go after the ideal, to think about the ideal, to look at the ideal. And again, the first definition of the ideal, which is the most suitable or the perfect, that makes sense. But the other one, that it really only comes from your imagination, is not at all likely to be a reality, is why a lot of people live in a constant state of disappointment. Right. About themselves, about their relationships, and about other people.
Yeah, I think that was a good way of explaining it. And so, is it just a Western philosophy, or do the Eastern people have a dualistic sense as well?
Uh, it manifests in a lot of different ways. Obviously, Eastern religions that do deal with yin and yang and a sense, an over sense of balance. And what over? How do I? What makes it an over sense of balance? Expecting that the desired result is balance, when it may not be. Uh, just think about this. You have a society of 100 people. It's not desirable that 50 of them treat the other people nice and 50 of them treat the other people crappy. That's that's balance, but that's not what you're looking for
Right.
in a community or a society. If you're running a business, uh, it's not your desire that half your products make a profit and half your products lose money. I mean, so that balance is not the goal, but balance is something that a dualistic society seeks a dualistic thinking seeks to put forth as being positive.
Right. So, I was trying to give Phil an example, and I don't know if I'm right about this example or not. So, it was like if you're in an Indian culture where it's like Buddhism or Hinduism, I feel like it's more if you ask that person like, "Hey, is your wife beautiful?" They'll more or less their response will be like, "She's my wife," rather than "she's beautiful," because they don't have that pedestal necessarily of ideal beauty. So do you think that actually plays a factor in their society? Not necessarily the balance part, but
Right.
holding that ideal as much as it does in our society.
I don't know. I'm trying to run through my mind with people I've dealt with from Indian culture, for instance. I've just recently been working with some old friends, trying to get some business work done, and most of them that I've dealt with are westernized enough by. There were obviously people I was doing business with, and so on and so forth. That I don't know that I sense that. It's an interesting thought, though. Like, what is beauty if it's not the ideal?
Right.
And since I don't think the ideal is real, then what is beauty? And that actually is an example of how a non dualistic approach to something can open up a fresh question. Um, if beauty is just what the culture is currently putting forth, so if you go back and you look at paintings from Raphael's day or something like that, uh, corpulent people, you know, were the upper class, largely because they're the ones who can afford to get fat. But so standards of beauty have changed all over the place. And then when I was in my 20s and 30s, Twiggy was kind of setting the stage, and so it was totally the opposite of that. Um, I think dualism opens the door for a lot of relativism too. And and so if life consists of two things being relatively equal but opposed, and the virtue's not in either of those things in that system. The virtue is in the tension or the balance that they create. And like I say, it's not the reason dualism is a tricky concept and it's hard to kind of break away from is because it has some positive aspects in it. Exercise, weight training, denying yourself now for the future, those all create a kind of dualistic tension and they're not bad. But they're not really the ground of reality, and they don't generally make for a great relationship.
Right. So with that, there are a lot of pros with it, and there's a lot of cons with it. Where do you find that the balance is best suited, or are you still on that exploration?
Um, for me personally, I think the most damage done by a dualistic ideal. Well, first of all, when I got through taking my own personal in-depth look at this, I felt like it was required that I renounce dualism as a definition of reality. Um, I'm not saying that it doesn't. There's not dualistic elements in reality, but the foundation upon which reality sits is not dualistic, and I can explain that in a little bit. So, having renounced that, that went a long way to setting me free, or it went a long way to making me aware of when I would slip into pursuit of the ideal. or I would judge somebody by the ideal, or I would judge myself or my circumstances by the ideal. And so the two areas that I find most destructive, if you embrace dualism and then are driven to have to think or indulge in the thinking of the ideal, is in personal disappointment and dissatisfaction with yourself, because you could always be better. You could always be thinner, stronger, faster, have more hair, whatever. And it's no end to it. So the general low level of personal satisfaction and health and security, I think, is attributable largely to dualism and the ideal. And the other is the transient nature of relationships. Is when you're relating to an ideal version of a friend, and that friend doesn't live up to it, then you really don't have a friend at all anymore, because the person that you thought they were by envisioning them in the ideal evaporates. And I think that's what you were saying.
Yeah, exactly.
The danger of putting somebody on an ideal pedestal is they may not be that way. And again, you go back to the definition of the ideal. Think of the pressure that this definition puts on there. Satisfying my conception of what is perfect or most suitable. So if I put that on you, Kevin, you don't even get a vote on what that is. And then the second one is existing only in the imagination, desirable or perfect, but not likely to become reality. And so it begs the question, if the perfect is defined by the ideal, which originates in our own imagination, then the perfect is a completely relative situation. Right. And so I find that the two areas are my own personal disappointment myself and a constant quest, not just to be better, but to be that thing. Right. That thing that I'm not right now. And so the quality of my life is defined by what I'm not, against my imagination of the ideal. And the same thing goes with the other person. Well, obviously this is desirable. Now, who determines that? I do. And when that person doesn't live up to it, all of a sudden there's very little to connect us in a relationship.
So I would say that for me it'd be more along the lines of dualism is good in the sense that I can strive for things, but as soon as I make the thing I'm striving for the ultimate goal, then it becomes destructive. So for instance, you keep talking about like weightlifting or running and stuff. I want to be in shape so I can be healthy. If I lose sight of that goal and it's to look like Arnold Schwarzenegger or whatever, then all of a sudden I can't reach that goal and it becomes destructive on myself. But if I'm doing it and I keep in mind what the actual underlying goal is of I want to be strong and healthy, and live a lifestyle where I can go hike and go run and play sports, then that aspect of it is healthy. So I guess that would be the balance for me, as long as the goal isn't to actually achieve the ideal, but just to see what the ideal could be. I don't think it's necessarily bad.
Yeah. Well, yeah, no, I wouldn't question that at all. Like I say, that we're talking about points of view, and there's things to see from every point of perspective, for sure. I have a weightlifting book at home, which I probably should read and use a little bit more. But one of the things I appreciated about it that caused me to buy it years ago was it said the point of being strong is practical. It's so that you can carry your groceries in without your arms getting tired. It's so that when you come home and your son or daughter wants to jump up in your arms, you can catch them and hold them. Right. You were talking about hiking or playing sports. I'm hoping that automatically includes people. Yeah. Not that you can't hike by yourself, you can't play horseshoes by yourself, but that's not the goal. Totally. The goal is relational, and I think that's why I feel like approaching life through a different lens than dualism and renouncing dualism so that the ideal doesn't become, and this is something else that I want to say. I know every time I talk about this, I'm reminded, it's not that there's not better versions of us. That is true. Right. But the better versions of us relate to the realities around us. They don't come from our imagination. If you live totally on the basis of a better imagination about yourself, you actually have a mental illness. Totally. And that's I think what this idea, the thing of the ideal, leads to, is it leads to a form of publicly acceptable mental illness where everybody's disappointed in themselves and one another. Well, just in case you're interested, why I reject dualism as a basis for reality is because I believe in God, and I believe in spiritual realities. I also believe in spiritual beings and normal people who follow and love God and agree with Him, and I believe in ones that don't. Commonly it's called like the devil or something like that. So the big winner in dualism is, in my mind, as a basis for reality, the big winner in dualism is the devil, because you have God on one hand, and you have the devil that's almost equal to Him, but opposed to Him, and that I think is a big lie, and I think it's confusing to people because it makes us feel like we're kind of pawns in this power struggle between the clash of the titans, when in reality, I think we're the ones that invest a lot of power and energy in those negative things to make them seem equal to good. But kissing your wife on the cheek and slapping her in the face are not even close to being equal things.
Totally.
Yeah.